Just so you know, there will be some mild e-begging and a Patreon ad in the middle of this video, so if that's something that you would like to skip, I have included time codes both in the video itself and on screen. Thank you so much, and enjoy the video. So, in the last couple weeks, I've looked at some of my own favorite and least favorite, or what I consider the best and worst missions in the Grand Theft Auto series. So, continuing on with that trend for a short while longer, I thought it would be fun this week to look at what I consider my favorite characters, period, in the Grand Theft Auto extended universe. Now, as per usual, I will not be including the 2D era characters in this list. Firstly, because I still haven't fully played the 2D era games, and secondly, because there aren't many characters to speak of with any real depth worth examining. Now, I'm going to choose my favorite character per game based on their appearance in that game. So, a character could be selected twice for their performances in different games. I'm going to try and not just always pick the protagonist, since they are always the character we know the most about, being controlled by the player. I'm also going to stick to only main characters for this video, and will be limiting myself to 4 nominees per game max. It's not entirely clear if I'll actually manage to stick to those rules though, as anybody who's seen the last few videos can attest to. Oh, go watch those, by the way, either before or after watching this. Lastly, I'll be going through all the nominations for each game first, and then select the winners at the very end, so keep that in mind. Enough rambling, let's get into it. Grand Theft Auto 3. Now, I'm going to assume at least a passive familiarity with all of the mainline entries to the series, and spare you a recap of what every single character I nominate has done, especially since we'll be going game by game. My first nominee is our protagonist, Claude, who isn't actually ever technically called that in this game, but details. Claude is a character I used to think had no personality, but, and perhaps this seems silly to some people, I have gotten a sense of the kind of character Claude is in this game, in part because of his appearance in San Andreas, which helped solidify the fact that, yes, he really just never says anything, and is the GTA universe's embodiment of giving absolutely zero fucks. The man simply does not have any to give away. He flips the bird to passing cars, betrays anybody who even slightly annoys him, will only work for money, and couldn't care less about why you're paying him to do something so long as you pay. He gives me almost Anton Chigurh vibes, or like Anton Chigurh meets Wes Wrench from the Fargo series. He's a lethal, brutal, and efficient killer. He does have motivations and passions, clearly, but he keeps those motivations entirely to himself, creating an air of mystery around him that can't help but be intriguing. Now I know, I already broke my rule. I said it should only be based on this game, but I can't help it. I'm only nominating him, and I still get a lot of personality out of Claude from what he does in this game. So, I think it still counts. Moving on. Next up is Salvatore Leone. Now, Sal doesn't get a ton of screen time in this game compared to Liberty City Stories, but the time he does get, he uses well. I mean, it's Frank Vincent. It would have been very hard not to include him on this list. In this game, we get the sense that Salvatore is, and has been, a boss in Liberty City for some time. He's not quite at the height of his power anymore though, and it's starting to show. He stresses about his wife, about snitches within his organization, and gives his capos full authority to cause chaos for the sake of keeping himself powerful. He's suspicious of everybody and everything, as Curly Bob puts it, and this makes for an entertaining antagonist when you are forced to take him out for your own survival, and a bit of revenge. And my next nominee is the person who facilitates that revenge, or pays for it at least. Asuka Kisen is another character who is getting a tiny bit of extra help in her nomination thanks to her appearance in GTA Advance, but it is very minor. All it helps to do is establish that Asuka and her brother Kenji have been jointly ruling the Yakuza for several years, 3 to be precise. Asuka in GTA 3 is an ambitious, ruthless, and calculated boss of her criminal organization. She's loyal to the people who are actually important to her, showing a great deal of humanity through her actions even if she, like most characters in GTA 3, rarely shows true empathy or compassion. They are all hardened criminals after all. Asuka especially gets to shine when showing her passion for avenging her brother's death, whom she believes was killed by the Colombians, and not the very man she's paying to wipe them out. It makes her out-of-nowhere death even more unsettling, since she's never given any kind of resolution. I think it would have been really interesting in an alternate universe where Asuka eventually learns of Claude's betrayal, but that isn't what we got, nor do I think it should have been. It leaves more questions unanswered for her character in an interesting way. Definitely a memorable character, and a surprisingly human one for GTA 3. On the other end of the spectrum, a character who is much harder to get a read on is my next nominee, Donald Love. However, his mystery, much like Claude, is a huge part of what grants him a nomination on this list. Donald Love in GTA 3 is a strange and enigmatic businessman. Exactly what his motivations are specifically are entirely unclear, beyond his desire to continue accumulating wealth and power. Why exactly he wants that wealth and power, or what precisely he uses it for, however, is a question that the game never answers, and what makes Love such a strange and fascinating character in the series. Now, Donald Love has a much different portrayal in Liberty City Stories that, while I still think works in the big picture, definitely changes his characterization significantly in this game, more so than other characters who've been in more than one game. In GTA 3 alone, though, Donald is just perfectly mysterious. He's rumored to have partaken in something called a morgue party. He has the power, wealth, and interest to pay for a friend of his, clearly a criminal of some variety, to be broken out of a federal prison by international gangsters. He's always calm, never showing even the slightest bit of concern for his plans being changed or interrupted, but operating like a cold, sterile businessman whose only interest is in achieving his goals, whatever they may be. The whole end of his plot thread with the empty package from his missions also plays a big role in adding to his mystery and intrigue, since he simply vanishes from the game, but intentionally so. There are so many interesting things to speculate on: what the packages were, why he wanted or needed them, or how the Oriental Gentleman plays into all of this, but not answering those questions is, I think, one of the best things that GTA 3 does, plot-wise. So, Grand Theft Auto Vice City. Once again, I gotta start with the protagonist in Tommy Vercetti. I promise, though, I won't always nominate them, just usually. Tommy, though, is certainly a character I find interesting enough to be considered and be a strong contender for Vice City's best character. Tommy is a man raised by crime. Though he alludes to having had aspirations early on to lead a different life and follow his father's more blue-collar one, that's not what he did. That very slight touch of regret that stems from this revelation, I think, adds a lot to Tommy's characterization, at least for me. Tommy seems to have had a good relationship with his father, though not with his mother, but since we never truly learn how or why he ended up working for the mob, I think not knowing is again better than being given every single detail. The lack of details about Tommy's origins both make sense in terms of the gameplay and need to not overwhelm the player with too much exposition, but it also makes sense in terms of his character, being reserved and unwilling to share details about his personal life with almost anybody, including himself and, by proxy, the player. Tommy isn't particularly empathetic, but he is loyal and places some value, it seems, in friendship, though a very twisted and perhaps necessary criminal version of friendship. He won't outright betray a friend, but he isn't averse to ignoring them or mistreating those who annoy him. He seems to value compatibility with people more than loyalty, though, as evidenced by his treatment of Kent Paul, and later Rosenberg, though that happens outside of this game, and the details are completely and intentionally vague. So few assumptions can be drawn from it. All of this is to say, Tommy is a fully developed character and human being, a terrifying one for sure, but thoroughly enjoyable, even if he isn't particularly relatable for me. An excellent portrayal. And speaking of excellent portrayals, we have one of my favorite performances across the Grand Theft Auto series in Ken Rosenberg. Ken is not only the deuteragonist, or sort of second to most important character in the story, he's also one of the only friends that Tommy seems to truly have, at least in this game. Again, we aren't counting what happens in San Andreas' introduction, or what Ken says about him in that game. Ken is a neurotic, paranoid criminal lawyer working for the Forelli family. He does a lot of blow, and is prone to panic attacks, given his line of work, for people who often wish to see him sleeping with the fishes. Ken is heavily based on Sean Penn's portrayal of David Kleinfeld in the movie Carlito's Way, a classic crime drama if you haven't seen it and are a fan of GTA movies like Scarface and The Godfather. A lot of Ken's surface characteristics, and even much of his appearance, is based directly on Kleinfeld, and although he does some similar things in-game to Kleinfeld in the movie, he is distinctly different in a very important way. Spoilers for a 30-year-old movie incoming. Unlike David Kleinfeld, Ken Rosenberg is never really the cause of Tommy's problems, like Kleinfeld is for Al Pacino's character in the movie. He is the catalyst for everything going wrong, but isn't nearly as selfish. It may be fair, though, to attribute this more to cowardice than actually being selfless or truly loyal to much beyond money. Ken is, after all, the only character left standing to stand by Tommy as the game's credits roll. My next nominee is a character who could not be standing next to Tommy as the credits roll because of his dramatic but heavily foreshadowed heel turn in the game's final scene. That is, of course, Mr. Lance Vance Dance. Now, Philip Michael Thomas playing this part on its own makes it amazing. Vice City had two primary influences that it wore on its sleeves, the first being Scarface, and the second being what prompted Rockstar to try and cast Thomas as Lance, Miami Vice. But although Lance may sound like Tubbs on the surface, and definitely dresses like him, that's about where the similarities stop. Lance is a mess. His character gets even better with his appearance in Vice City Stories, but even based on this appearance alone, he's great. I remember being shocked in an unpleasant way when first being betrayed by Lance as a kid, and never fully understanding why he did it. Playing the game as an adult, though, they practically spell out Lance's betrayal in the sky. If you pay close attention, even without the added context of VCS, Lance is clearly a person who has always wanted to be in charge, but always found it either necessary or convenient to follow instead. He's loyal above all else to himself, and makes for a great foil/sideman to Tommy throughout the game, while being a satisfying secondary antagonist to eliminate in the game's epic final firefight. I'll admit, an enormous amount of what makes Lance entertaining is Philip Michael Thomas's performance. The man could probably make anything sound entertaining, but the script here is still good, and while I wish Lance got a little bit more screen time in the original Vice City, he still gets enough for the scope of his character arc to be communicated effectively. I did have a few more people I wanted to nominate, but all of them fall into the category of side characters, while Tommy, Ken, and Lance are most definitely main characters. So I think I'll revisit this topic again, perhaps in the coming weeks, and take a look at side characters specifically. That way, I can also highlight some more obscure ones who might otherwise never make the cut against characters like Niko Bellic and the like. So, moving on to San Andreas. First up for San Andreas is probably my favorite antagonist across the series, one terrifyingly based in large part on a real man, though with plenty of dramatic flair, obviously, Frank Tenpenny. Now, similar to Lance, while Tenpenny is already a plenty interesting and well-written character, He is also helped enormously by the fact that his voice actor is Samuel L. freaking Jackson. He absolutely nails this role. Tenpenny is a corrupt cop who is interested in one singular thing, being the absolute authority of his domain. Tenpenny may not be the Los Santos police chief, but he is the head of his own unit, and a unit that operates with a lot of freedom. He is a mean-spirited, dishonest, backstabbing bully accompanied by another mean-spirited, dishonest, and backstabbing bully with daddy issues. Honestly, I think Frank Tenpenny is among my favorite villains in video games as a whole, up there with characters like Handsome Jack or Andrew Ryan. Just so much fun to hate and eventually take down. I could talk about his character for a long time, since, as I alluded to, much of the San Andreas story is based upon events in real life surrounding the LA riots, so there's plenty to say here. To spare you that, since I've already talked about him many times in the past, we'll move on to my next nominee. Next up is the player's not actually, but basically brother-in-law, Cesar Villalpando. Now, Cesar is another character who I wish got more screen time, but that's basically my biggest negative with him. Cesar is very similar to another character we'll look at in GTA 4, if you know you know, in that he serves as the player's best friend and go-to companion throughout the game. Cesar's loyalty is never in question, and in fact, it's Carl who is initially rude to Cesar before he sticks his neck out to his gang for Carl out of respect for his girlfriend's brother. Cesar strikes me as the kind of person who might actually be an overall good person if he wasn't actively involved in criminal work that frequently saw civilian casualties. Outside of his criminal activity, he shows empathy, intelligence, assertiveness, bravery, loyalty, and competence. Cesar is just awesome, and everybody knows it. You know it, I know it, let's move on. 2. A character who has grown on me more and more every time I've played San Andreas, WooZiMo. Now, I don't remember ever disliking Woozy's character at all, but I do remember being kind of apathetic towards him. As I get older, though, I like him more and more. Woozy is the blind leader of the Mountain Cloud Boys triad in San Fierro, and while the blind jokes are shallow and cringe, his depth of character most certainly is not. Woozy is a man who has always sought to prove to people that he was more than his handicap, and he tries desperately to hide this fact from anyone he doesn't trust, out of fear of shame. WooZiMo might otherwise just be an interesting boss character, but he really shines when you get to see him and Carl just hanging out, playing video games together, or much later in the game when he's running the casino. In fact, it was his role in the casino missions which ultimately made him one of my favorites. Woozy is smart, funny, brave as all hell, and never unwilling to get right into the trenches with his triad soldiers, despite literally being blind. A true badass, if I ever saw one. And speaking of badasses, my last nominee for San Andreas is another heavy-hitting celebrity role in Myke Torino, portrayed by the very talented and very crazy James Woods. Now, Myke Torino doesn't get nearly as much time to have his character developed as, say, Tenpenny, Cesar, or even Woozy, but he doesn't even need it. Myke only appears in a handful of missions, and yet his appearances and role in the story are unforgettable. Once more, his actor is doing some heavy lifting here, but the character is also just so much fun. In fact, this scene from the mission Stowaway is one of my favorite things in GTA, period.
What's your take on this?
Damn! I thought them was your people.
Listen, Carl, we've got a problem. Some traitors from another department think they can help the overseas situation by financing militaristic dictators in exchange for arms contracts.
Hey, ain't that exactly what you do?
Well, kind of, but we get to pick our dictators. Degenerates that we can control. We try to stay the hell away from these guys with principles, because that just muddies the waters.
Yeah, okay.
Okay, so, of course, these idiots have stolen a consignment of landmines, and they plan to offload them in the Middle East and cause a little ruckus, and everybody goes crazy and have a lot of problems. I mean, Carl, do you like maiming people? Curious.
Maiming? Some people, shit.
Anyway, the point is, you and me, Carl, hey, we're the same. Now, yeah, it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it. But if you screw this up, it causes a tinderbox situation all over Latin America and the Middle East. Now, look, I spoke to the big man. You got clearance to eliminate these fuckers. How's that? Huh?
Man, kill government agents?
Kill Schmill. Come on, don't look at it that way, will you? Think of it as pest control. It works for me. All right, come on. I can't stay here now. I'm too hip. I gotta go. Okay? I'm out of here.
I feel like Myke deserves a nomination from that one scene alone, but he also goes on to demonstrate he's also a very fascinating character. Like many GTA characters, he is heavily stereotypical, but given the context and purpose of GTA's world, it is entirely appropriate in my opinion. Myke is a G-man working for the CIA, and strongly opposed to the work of the FBI or DEA, or any other government agencies. A fairly common joke back then in the media, and still to this day. Because of this, we don't learn much of anything about Myke's actual life or history, but we can discern enough from the way that he speaks and conducts himself to get an idea of what kind of man he is. Someone you do not want as an enemy. That is for certain. He can be hilarious or terrifying, depending on what the situation calls for, but he is always focused on getting his mission done, no matter the cost, while also making sure to reward those who stay loyal to him and his cause. Moving on to Liberty City Stories, we have another protagonist, but one that has already appeared in a previous game, Tony Cipriani. Now, I didn't nominate Tony for GTA 3 because, honestly, I never really much cared for Michael Madsen's portrayal of him, and always preferred Danny Mastrogiorgio's version hands down. Now, this is down to, in large part, the fact that Michael Madsen was a very busy man at the time, and more importantly, to the still relatively small developer Rockstar, a very expensive man. So he didn't have a lot of lines, or much of a role in the story past the first act. I mean, your character in that game doesn't even speak, so Tony's only chance to speak to anybody and get a response was his very brief interaction with Salvatore about his mother, and his interactions with his mother yelling at him off camera. Tony in GTA 3 was basically just Tony Soprano with Michael Madsen's voice. In Liberty City Stories, though, since he is now the playable character, we get to spend a lot more time with him, and while he is still very heavily based on Tony Soprano, he really gets the chance to become his own separate character in LCS thanks to Mastrogiorgio's performance. What kind of person is he, though? Well, he is an absolute psychopath who cares only about his mother and his pseudo-father/boss. Anybody else he could not give two shits about, and he will do whatever and kill whoever either his mother or boss tell him to. Beyond that, he is judgmental, arrogant, and just generally pretty rude. It's great. Tony is awful in a way that is just so satisfying, because everyone around him is usually just as awful or even slightly worse. Tony doesn't really have any actual redeemable qualities, but his character is just so chaotic and fun and so very GTA. I love it. I mean, he literally blows up Little Italy. All of it. Dude is nuts. Okay, so my next nominee is also our first repeat character in Salvatore Leone. Thing is, if I was willing to nominate Sal for GTA 3 from his appearance in that game, I couldn't not nominate him here. LCS is where we really get to see most of Sal's character. His relationship with Maria, his relationship with the other mob families in Liberty, his relationship with families back in the old country, and, most importantly, his relationship with Tony. Something that is only very briefly seen in 3 when Sal asks about Tony's mother. Here, though, we get to see that father dynamic that I mentioned when discussing Tony. Sal treats Tony like, and seems to think of him like, the son he already had, but neglected, I guess? A second son. I don't know, it honestly would have made a lot of sense for it to have been Joey in Tony's role here, but whatever. Michael Rapaport and Frank Vincent was probably a bit much for LCS's comparatively tiny budget, next to something like Vice City or San Andreas, though. Anyways, Salvatore Leone in LCS is just as paranoid, just as grumpy, and just as entertaining as ever. His dynamic with Tony is among my favorite in the series, up there with Billy Gray and Johnny Klebitz, and Victor and Lance Vance. Frank Vincent is definitely a big part of why I love him so much, but I just can't help it. Honestly, when he was cast as anyone, I was almost always immediately inclined to like the character. He's just so freaking charming. The complete opposite of our next character, and another second appearance from Donald Love. Now, as I said before, Donald's portrayal in LCS is arguably a significant departure from what we saw in 3. However, I still think it makes sense, or rather, I have since corrected it all in my own headcanon, and thus no longer care about it. What I do care about is how much fun Donald is in Liberty City Stories. He's definitely still insane, as LCS elaborates on the whole morgue party joke from 3 and makes him an outright cannibal. He's sleazy in that Liberty City politician kind of way, and he's just so obsessed with his own magnificence. Now, there's definitely a big element of camp here. This is like 2006 after all, but since they never actually elaborate on why, we can just assume he's a very colorful but distinguished millionaire sociopath. I feel like there are elements of this Donald Love in Avon Hertz from GTA Online, although I know he was mostly based on Elon Musk. Donald Love in LCS, and in 3 really, is a horrible person. The kind of person I would detest in real life, but hey, this is GTA, and in GTA, he's A-OK. On to the second and last of the Stories games, with Vice City Stories, and my first nominee, another protagonist. I know. Look, just because I nominate him doesn't mean I'm gonna pick him, okay? But Victor Vance is literally one of my favorite characters across the series, and I've said it multiple times. Vic is the reluctant villain, I suppose. He's a man put into a difficult situation who ultimately dealt with it in a very destructive and dangerous way, but it's clear that he always wanted to be a better person than he was. And he was hyper-aware of just how bad he was, and it caused him a significant amount of internal distress. Vic joins the army to help pay for his brother's medical bills, but he's framed by a corrupt army sergeant and dishonorably discharged, at which point he begins doing illegal work just to make ends meet. Victor feels like almost a proto-Nico in this vein. He certainly enjoys the violence, but he also seems to be bothered by that fact. He never wanted to be a GTA protagonist, for lack of a better way to put it. But this was the life that he ended up living. Now, Victor is by no means an angel. He does plenty to make himself just as horrible as most of the people that he takes down self-righteously, and this is something even the game's other characters bring up. Between his relationship to his brother Lance, his love interest Louise, and himself, he might be the most complex protagonist in the 3D era. He's nuanced, and that's something that was quite rare during this era of the series. Victor feels more like a movie character that audiences would be able to relate to while still being horrified by their actions, instead of a violent caricature like, say, Claude or even Tommy Vercetti. Then there's his brother, and yet another repeat nomination in Lance T. Vance.
Hey, bro!
Now, there's not a ton more I need to say about Lance here, but I still wanted to nominate him. Lance's character doesn't change substantially from game to game, especially since they only take place 2 years apart, but this game does a magnificent job of setting up his character arc in the original Vice City and giving it further context. Lance doesn't arrive right away, but as soon as he does, he starts causing problems for Victor, much like he would for Tommy, although canonically that had yet to happen. Like I said when talking about Sal and Tony, I adore the dynamic between Victor and Lance. Vice City Stories just has some phenomenal acting, and it's sad to me how few people have actually played it at this point. VCS is, in terms of its story, a lot like a blend between the best elements of the 3D era and HD era ways of telling stories. It's significantly more dramatic and emotional at times, while still being incredibly silly and very GTA. Vice City Stories will forever hold a strange place in my heart for being so simultaneously amazing and horrible at times. But Vic is just the best. We're not done though, because as I just said, VCS has some amazing acting. The next character is no exception with Jerry Martinez. It's always a bit of a toss-up for me between Tenpenny, Dimitri, and Martinez for favorite antagonists, but Jerry is just so goddamn entertaining. He's a power-tripping criminal who somehow wound up a sergeant and used his position in the army to do even more crime. Initially, he's mostly an annoyance, a relatively minor antagonist it would seem. That is, until the player strikes at him. The rivalry between Vic and Jerry is another fantastic dynamic across the series, but they unfortunately don't get many chances to actually interact one-on-one beyond the game's first few missions. And the same goes for my last nominee of Vice City Stories, Louise Cassidy Williams. I know, I repeat myself, and I'm sure I'm getting annoying at this point, but oh well. I love Louise so much, and her and Victor's very brief relationship is easily my favorite in the entire Grand Theft Auto series. Louise is a woman who has spent her entire life held down by the men around her. Her brother, though protective, was a pervert, her father physically abusive, and her first husband, whom she is still with when we meet her, is also both physically and emotionally abusive. She also has a child with him, Mary Beth Williams, and though she arguably isn't a very good mother, frequently leaving her daughter in the care of her sister to commit crime with Vic, she is very clearly a person in way over her head with the crappy hand life dealt her from the beginning. Despite all of this, Louise continues to have some hope, thanks in part to Victor. Her arc becomes all the more tragic when a misunderstanding, or perhaps an actual affair, leads to her and Victor calling things off, with them only getting closure in Louise's final moments after she was kidnapped and beaten by the Mendez cartel, specifically because of her relationship to Vic. And despite this, she still has only kind things to say moments before her death. Louise is a lot like Kate McCreary in GTA 4, being the sympathetic love interest, but in my opinion, she's a bit more interesting as a character and feels more appropriately GTA with how significantly flawed she is, while also being very relatable.
There's much point in that.
Come on, Louise.
We could have had something special.
Yeah. We did have something special.
Make sure Mary Jo takes care of my baby.
Oh, Louise. Louise.
This video and all videos on my channel are brought to you in large part by the wonderful support of my patrons on patreon.com. An extra special thank you to my executive producer tier patrons, Ezra Hambrick, Mason Collin, Chuck K45, and King GTA 15, as well as my Walker Villain tier patron, Michael Vandenberg. Patrons at these tiers also have the option to promote a little bit of their own content, so this video is brought to you by Ezra's Let's Play channel, Scott Games 99, Mason Collins' podcast channel, We're About Everything, and Chuck K45's Upstart Farming channel. I release all videos a little early to patrons, and completely uncensored. I give you any of the original music tracks I've created for a given video, and for extra generous supporters, you can even reserve a slot for your favorite game in my ongoing series, The Game Vault. You'll also get to see your name in the credits of all videos that are produced while you're pledged, get access to a small patron-only Discord where you can easily speak with me or see little behind-the-scenes snippets, and you'll receive my eternal gratitude. Seriously, especially these days, those of you who support my work directly are absolutely incredible, and I can't properly express how grateful I am to you all. Thank you so much. Patreon.com/thecriminalhistorian. Today's mid-video interruption is a little bit longer. Before I go on though, I want to say at the beginning that I am doing just fine. I am finally stable these days from YouTube. I'm not exactly well off, still well below what is apparently the average wage in my country, but I am doing just fine. I am incredibly lucky to even be in a position to make sections like this in a video, or even make videos for a living. I know that. So please, and I really mean this, if you're struggling financially right now, as I did for so many years, do not donate. Go ahead and move on to the rest of the video. I don't want your money. The only people I want to stick around are those with a few extra bucks to spend who really enjoy the content that I make, and who are feeling a little bit generous. If that's not you, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the video. You are awesome. So what's actually up? What's with all the preamble? Well, I like to always be transparent when money can be involved, but like I said, I am alright. This isn't quite as desperate as needing help with rent money as it's been in the past. Even if nobody donates because of this, I am going to make it happen. But I'm also not afraid to ask for help. Especially asking the internet for help when it concerns a cat. Because if the internet wasn't designed with the specific purpose of crowdfunding happier lives for kitties, I want to live in a different timeline. Fans of my streams might know my oldest kitty, Link, but back in July of last year, I got a new addition through circumstance. Mr. Joseph Peepers here fell into my care when my neighbor died. Peepers had taken a liking to me, and despite being in a precarious financial situation at that time, I committed to taking him in because of a local organization that helped to pay for him to be fixed, and his very first vet visit. When I took him home to be mine that first time with his medication, I hoped he would be better within a few weeks, as the entire time I'd known him before that, he'd been a sneezy, sniffly, sick boy. Full of love like you wouldn't believe, but perpetually sick. Anyways, he never really got better. He has constantly had a variety of issues, and although I've been able to afford to take him in myself thanks to the channel doing well in the last few months, he has already cost me thousands, and he is still sick. As of last Friday, February 9th, he started to get really sick, and he has been in a rough shape ever since. As of the recording of this script, he is already doing better, but the most recent vet visit that I had to do to get him to this point was really brutal for me. So this has been my exceptionally long-winded way of asking you to help out my little buddy Mr. Peepers. I'm a YouTuber. I don't qualify for any insurance through my employer, and I certainly don't have cat health insurance. I don't even have human health insurance. Point is, vets are ridiculously expensive, and if that weren't the case, I wouldn't be asking. One last time, just in case you decided to listen to this despite not being in a good financial situation yourself, do not donate if you're struggling. Please. I will make sure Peepers gets the care that he needs, no matter what. But like I said, internet, cats, I felt I would be a terrible parent not to take advantage of this very unique opportunity that I have thanks to my job. If you would like to donate, all links will be in the description down below. You can use PayPal if you want to pay me directly, but if you'd also like to get a few things for yourself through the process, you can sign up on my Patreon, and I believe there's also an option to donate directly through Patreon, but just signing up is also good enough for me. Whether you donate or not though, thank you so very much for listening, and for watching this video. That's really all the support I can ask for at the end of the day, and I am forever grateful to each and every one of my amazing patrons, and everyone who has ever donated directly to the channel. Seriously, you have genuinely helped me. You are awesome. Enjoy the rest of the video. But now we move on to the HD era, where characters become significantly more relatable in general. Well, in GTA 4 anyway. And so, of course, I have to nominate my other favorite protagonist, next to Victor Vance, Niko Bellic. Niko is like Vic in a lot of ways, but due to being from a much more popular game, is the much more well-known tortured soul of the two. So to many fans of the series, Niko was likely the first protagonist they played who showed real humanity beyond a surface level. Niko Bellic is a man with truckloads of baggage. He was an unwilling participant in the Yugoslav wars and grew up around the geopolitical haze that followed in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse. As the original trailers put it, he's killed people, smuggled people, and sold people, but there remains a faint hope that in America he could build a new life. We have a lot of characters to get through tonight, so I won't talk about Niko forever, because I most certainly could. He is a man haunted by many demons, but who clearly has a good person inside of them who desperately wants to escape. The most intriguing part of Niko's character, I think, is the unspoken question of whether or not his actions have ultimately killed that good person. Whether or not he is even capable of living a normal, peaceful life. I've done full-length episodes of my original series, Grand Theft Auto Biographies, on most of the characters in today's list, so if you want to go watch my episode on Niko, or any other character after this video, I will include a link to the series in the description. For now, let's move on to Niko's cousin. Yes, of course, Roman Bellic is a staple here, and someone I imagine has rarely been omitted from lists like this. Everybody loves Roman, how could you not? He is initially sort of poised as the comedic relief to Niko's straight man, and he does serve that role, but Roman is much deeper than that, and I think that's why he's stuck around in our public memories for so long. Not just because he annoyed us asking to go bowling, but because he feels like a genuine person. I think a lot of us have either known a Roman, or maybe been one ourselves. Roman covers a lot of his pain with comedy. He isn't just cracking jokes for joke's sake. His bright and optimistic nature might be what some perceive as ignorance or naivete, but Roman isn't unaware of how difficult and dangerous life can be for him. And although Roman isn't completely innocent, really nobody in the world of GTA is, he is arguably one of the most innocent in the series, and depending on which ending you discuss for GTA 4, it makes the end of his story all the more tragic. Another character that is similarly loved by pretty much everyone, myself included, is the wonderfully difficult to understand little Jacob Hughes. But although picking up exactly what Jacob is saying sometimes, specifically, may be tricky for me, picking out his intentions and his motivations is not. Jacob is a good friend. A truly loyal friend, but not someone who values blind obedience for the sake of it. Someone who stands by their friends because they are their friends, and without hesitation is always prepared to help those he cares about at the drop of a hat. Jacob is always one of my favorite characters to have a hangout with in GTA 4. He's just such a good guy, at least in the context of GTA criminals, and the kind of character you want to have your back in a firefight who can also speak truth to power, and has some killer taste in music. And the last nominee for GTA 4, sticking to my rule of maximum 4 per game, has to be Patrick "Packy" McCreary, one of the very few GTA 4 characters to be seen again in GTA 5, but this nomination is based entirely on his appearances in 4. Packy is a lot like Jacob, in that he is exceedingly loyal to his friends, but he is perhaps just a tad bit crazier. Being raised in a large part by his older and even more violent brothers, Packy is GTA 4's take on the stereotypical New York Irish mobster, and is easily my favorite example of the trope. A good friend to Niko, but a wild card. Perhaps not quite as reliable as Jacob, or not in the same way, but still always prepared to help his friends, even if that means robbing a bank and killing civilians in the process. On to GTA 4's first DLC with The Lost and Damned, and my first nominee, Billy Gray. Now, unlike a lot of my favorite characters, Billy doesn't really have many, or maybe any, redeeming traits. He is a complete bastard. A lot like Jerry Martinez, but he plays that role absolutely perfectly. Billy is a bully, plain and simple. He's rude, he's an idiot, he always thinks with his dick or his fists, and he never appreciates having his authority questioned for any reason. So, the reason Billy earns a nomination is that handsome Jack element. He is just fantastic at being a character that you love to hate. I actually find him more entertaining as a character than Johnny Klebitz, who I never disliked, but never particularly cared about the way that I did most of the other protagonists in the series. A lot of that, though, may come down to me not playing Lost and Damned back when it first came out, and thus having far less nostalgia for it and its characters. Billy, though, is always a fun time, especially killing him. Another character more interesting to me than Johnny, actually, is Johnny's best friend, Jim Fitzgerald, who doesn't get a ton of time to shine in the story, but what little he does, he makes good use of. Jim was technically in GTA 4, but his character hadn't been modeled or named as such at the time, but it was in Lost and Damned that he got his real debut. Jim is, like a lot of my favorite characters, a truly loyal friend. The Lost and Damned itself isn't really all that long, so again, Jim really only gets a handful of missions where he plays a starring role, but his voice actor's performance, and the way his character is written, just leaves a very strong impression on me. Speaking of brief but very strong impressions, I completely left out Chinatown Wars from my videos discussing the best and worst missions, simply because I had only played it for the first time in a bit of a rush for my GTA biography series a few years ago. Because of that, I didn't have a great grasp on all the game's missions, as I had only played them once. The characters, on the other hand, are a different story. I had to get to know some of these characters as a part of the process of casting their VAs for my Huang episode, since the original game had no voice acting. So I feel like I got to know the cast of Chinatown Wars much better than the missions. And I think one of the best performances I got was from the game's protagonist, Huang Li. Huang isn't a particularly deep character, he isn't all that relatable or empathetic, but he is just so lovable and sassy. Huang reminds me a bit of what Claude might have been like if he spoke, though unlike Claude, Huang can show genuine emotion when appropriate, and may be doing a bit of the Roman thing of hiding his pain underneath his humor. Huang's humor is different though, dry, bitter, and sarcastic. Despite growing up very privileged by all accounts, he seems to have this attitude even before the events of the game puts him into a position of actually having something to complain about. He's just a really fun character that fits so perfectly into the world of GTA Chinatown Wars, specifically, and is one of my favorite protagonists to actually play as. My next nominee is Detective Wade Heston. Heston is an LCPD cop trying to crack down on the Triad operations in Liberty, but who isn't above a little blackmail to further benefit his career. Although that's how his connection to Huang initially starts, Wade goes to actually form a real friendship with Huang that has that buddy cop vibe after Huang helps him out a couple times. I think one of the things that endears me to Heston is that he doesn't follow that trope of similar characters eventually betraying the protagonist due to their connection with the law. Wade simply sticks by Huang to the end and helps him to discover the truth about his uncle, not just because it will be good for his career, but because he seems to actually want Huang to find closure, even if they do come from radically different worlds. And my last nominee for Chinatown Wars is Zhao Ming, a truly crazy character that I just love so much. Zhao Ming isn't deep. He is one of the few people poised to take control of the Liberty City Triad in the wake of Huang's father being killed before the game starts. Zhao has Huang work for him on a couple occasions to help him secure his chance of becoming the next Triad boss, but it's the little things he does that make him an unforgettable character for me, like firing a minigun from the back of a pickup truck like an absolute maniac, or ripping a man's still beating heart out of his chest before killing him. That is Zhao Ming. Back to GTA 4 with the second DLC though, in Ballad of Gay Tony. Now, Ballad I did play when it came out, and so I do have plenty of nostalgia for its protagonist. However, and of course I'm biased, I also just think that Luis Lopez is a more interesting character, to me anyways, than Johnny Klebitz. Luis is a man just trying, desperately, to enjoy life. He's as laid back as one could possibly be in his hectic life, but he often serves as an emotional anchor to his friends and family, as a generally strong person, both in body and in mind. Luis might be the most together protagonist of the HD era, though he would have some competition in Franklin Clinton, whom he also shares some other surface-level similarities with. Luis cares about and takes care of his struggling family with his comparatively lucrative career. He looks out for his friends even when they put themselves or him in dangerous situations, and he refuses to be pushed around or allow others to treat those that he cares about with disrespect, all the while being almost completely level-headed and calm. Luis embodies cool in the pantheon of GTA protagonists to me. But, of course, I need to also nominate the titular character of Ballad, Gay Tony Prince himself. Now, Tony is, in a lot of ways, a stereotype, or at least appears so at first glance. He's a gay nightclub owner in a fictional New York, but like so many characters, his performance makes him stand out as a real, if eccentric person, and a very entertaining one at that. Tony is, in many ways, the opposite of Luis. Not very often composed, prone to dramatic freakouts, and either causing or exacerbating stressful situations in his own life and the lives of his friends. But maybe that's why I relate to him so much. Tony has many moments of weakness, but when the chips are down, like most of my favorites, he will act to protect and help his friends, even if doing so is significantly scarier for a man such as Tony, who has no interest in protracted firefights. Tony and Luis's dynamic is also another of my favorites alongside Lance and Victor, and Tony and Salvatore. They play off each other so well, in no small part thanks to their amazing voice actors, but Tony just stands out as one of my all-time favorite performances in the whole series, thanks to a fantastic performance and great writing. But Ballad does also have a Billy Gray type character who is incredibly fun to hate, even if he isn't the DLC's main antagonist, or even an antagonist in the traditional sense, Maury Kibbutz. Now, Brucey initially played Maury's role in the early parts of GTA 4, with his steroidal rage being played entirely for laughs. Maury, however, brings substantial depth to Brucey's character, and shows us just how bad Brucey could have been with his much more annoying older brother. Maury is just as obnoxious, but that's the point. Nobody likes Maury, and that's why I love this character. Just a thoroughly satisfying character to hate, and while it would have been kind of satisfying to maybe punch him ourselves at some point, seeing Brucey do it was so much better, and one of my favorite scenes in GTA 4 and its DLCs.
Oh, God, oh, yeah! What the fuck, man? What the fuck are you doing? Oh, you know the rules! I'm sorry, Maury, I forgot, man! Never in the face!
Moving on to GTA 5, we have one of two protagonists I'm going to nominate, Michael DeSanta. Michael, to me, feels like a good blend of the more serious elements introduced by GTA 4, and the more silly elements introduced by 5 and present in the series' roots. Michael comes off as, and perfectly fits the role of, GTA protagonist. He's unhinged, completely selfish, and prone to being and acting crazy. Perfectly comfortable with committing mass acts of crime if it stands to benefit him. But despite all of these more cinematic, gamey traits, he is also a real human being whose fear for his family's safety serves as the catalyst for the entire GTA 5 story. Michael isn't completely insane like Trevor, who represents the other side of the coin, but he's also not on a bitter revenge quest that ruins the lives of everyone around him, like Nico. He does end up ruining the lives of everyone around him, just by different means and for different reasons. Michael feels like, in a way, the perfect GTA protagonist in terms of disposition. A movie character on one hand, and also probably not coincidentally obsessed with movies and movie making, and a real person on the other hand. A father and a friend, just a really bad one. Don't be friends with Michael. It never ends well, and all of that makes for one entertaining character. But if we're gonna talk about characters who keep your eyes glued to the screen, we gotta talk about Trevor. Of course we do. Trevor is another character I feel like has been talked about so much, even more so than the other protagonists, that I don't need to say too much. What earns Trevor a place on this list is almost entirely the absolutely unforgettable performance from Stephen Ogg. Trevor is the embodiment of how most people play GTA games. Or a lot of people anyway. He is completely and utterly crazy as the day is long. He might be a cannibal, he has an unhealthy love for firearms, and he lives in the middle of nowhere. Again, I feel like anything I can say about Trevor has been said a million times. He's just Trevor. I absolutely love him every time he's on screen. As a character, Trevor is quite confusing, and he's kinda meant to be, but since I never had any specific criteria in mind, none of that matters. He is just pure GTA entertainment and a huge part of what makes GTA 5's story so much fun and so memorable. And my final nominee for GTA 5, and since I'm not going into GTA Online for this list, my final nominee of the night is of course Lamar Davis. I know you're probably sick of hearing me say this, but by now I hope you've realized just how important a voice actor is at bringing a character to life and making them a favorite regardless of how good their writing is. It helps then that Lamar's writing is also fantastic and always on point. Lamar, in many ways, represents the mentality of GTA San Andreas. He is a gangster through and through. Unlike Franklin, he isn't interested in making it big, or really doing much of anything with his life besides making money and spending time with his friends. In fact, since loyalty has come up so many times tonight, Lamar is easily the character who embodies loyalty more than almost any other. He, like a few others I've mentioned, is always ready to help his friends without a single moment of hesitation. In fact, this serves as a huge part of the arc that he helps Franklin go on throughout the game, and arguably his own arc, although I, for one, never got the sense that Lamar finally learned something from Stretch's final betrayal. Lamar is just so much fun though, and like Trevor, is a character who is just hard to peel your eyes off of whenever he's on screen. Which means when both Trevor and Lamar are together, you know you're in for a good time. And my winner for Best Character of GTA 3 is Asuka Kasen. Now again, I don't ultimately have a specific criteria in mind. This isn't the character I think is the most good, or bad, or most relatable necessarily, though all of those things go into my thought process when deciding a favorite. Asuka is both a fascinating criminal and a relatable human being, especially in comparison to a lot of the other characters in GTA 3 who are far more cartoonish. Not that Asuka isn't a bit silly and cartoony. I mean, it's still early Grand Theft Auto, but she also has lovers, she has a brother she clearly cares about and highly respects, and she has a tactical mind, overseeing the destruction of the Colombian cartel briefly and successfully interrupting business for both the cartel and the Yardies with her Yakuza's considerable presence on Staunton Island. Wonderful work by Liana Pai. For GTA Vice City, the winner is Ken Rosenberg. Much as I love Lance and Tommy, Ken is just such a lovable rascal. He's got that Saul Goodman energy, and is just such an endearing performance. I mean, he is not only one of the few characters to be seen in more than one game, but also to have a substantial role in both, which I think speaks to how great he was back in his original appearance. Rosie baby, I love ya, you bonkers ambulance chaser. For San Andreas, it was a bit of a tough call, between Myke Torino and Frank Tenpenny, but ultimately, for me, Tenpenny takes home the prize. I mean, James Woods is great, but beating Samuel L. Jackson is always a challenge. He is a near-perfect villain in terms of his performance, writing, and motivations. He is who I think of when I hear Grand Theft Auto antagonist, and more so, who I think of when I think about the game San Andreas. For Liberty City stories, it's an easy pick for Salvatore Leone as my favorite. Tony Cipriani is also fantastic, but I just love Frank Vincent so much, and we get to see so much more of this character in LCS versus 3. Salvatore may not be the playable character, but in a lot of ways, he is just as much the protagonist of that game as Tony is. Maybe even more so in some ways, considering it's him that gives the final speeches to the villain, and him who played the starring role in the game's epilogue. For Vice City stories, though, it was tough. Really tough. I love all 4 of my nominees as characters so much. But in the end, I think for me, Victor has to be the winner. It was really hard to pick between him and Lance, especially because arguably Lance is a little bit more consistently written, having 2 games to be developed, but Victor is easily the most relatable protagonist of the 3D era, and remains a strong contender for my favorite protagonist across the series, so he also wins my favorite character of one of my favorite games in the series. Similarly to picking between Lance and Victor, picking between Nico and Roman was also very, very difficult. Roman, though, too, just ever so slightly beats out his cousin this time. Perhaps Nico's bitterness has always been more relatable than Roman's optimism, but as I myself turn a page in my life, I find myself more and more in admiration of Roman's ability to find the bright side in a situation. This one was really tricky. I literally wrote out the winner as Nico and changed it last minute because I think it's only been very recently that I've started to enjoy Roman a little bit more. Nico remains one of my favorite protagonists in the series and one of my all-time favorite characters, but Roman, at least today, is taking home the bowling trophy. As for Lost and Damned, much as I love Jim Fitzgerald, I don't think he gets enough screen time, or perhaps has enough screen presence, to beat out Mr. Billy Gray for the top spot. Billy Gray is a fantastic villain, and up there next to Tenpenny and Martinez. Handsome Jack levels of love to hate, almost, though he doesn't quite get enough time to get that far. Still, certainly more entertaining to me in the long term than the DLC's own protagonist or any of its other characters. A complete bastard, and a very memorable one. As for Chinatown Wars, I don't know if it's just his music or his unhinged insanity, but I couldn't not pick Zhao Ming. Nobody in Chinatown Wars is particularly deep, not shallow, but the game's story was at least limited by the lack of cutscenes and the actual voice acting, as well as the writing being a little bit more basic. But in that context, Zhao Ming really shines as the most memorable character to me from that game. He's also got a little bit of that love-to-hate thing going on, with how arrogant he is right up to his death, despite not actually being guilty of the crime that Huang accuses him of. So he gets a full arc, a great death, and plenty of scenes that really get to the heart of the game and stick with you. And if anybody other than Gay Tony won Best Character from the Ballad of Gay Tony, well, I feel it would have been a shame. But seriously, there's a good reason the DLC is named after him, as he is one of the best characters the GTA series ever produced, in my opinion, and easily my favorite of his eponymous DLC. Tony is a mess, but like Ken Rosenberg perhaps, he is a very lovable mess. He is a perfect example of the GTA silliness done correctly. A character that is very much based in American stereotypes, as the whole of the series is, but who still feels believable as a real person. And lastly, for Grand Theft Auto V, my pick for Best Character is Lamar Davis. Lamar, like Tony, just fits so perfectly into the world of Grand Theft Auto. He is funny, endearing, quotable as all hell, but also crazy, violent, and prone to flying off the handle when pushed. When it comes down to it, I just don't have much of anything negative to say about how Lamar's character is written. He is believably ridiculous, you might say, and was an instant addition to the roster of classic characters in the series when he was first introduced over 10 years ago. So, 10 characters, but who among my best picks for each game is my best pick for the whole series? It's 0.
Then them some pretty strong draws.
I'm the Criminal Historian, and if you want to help me with my ridiculous vet bills, you can donate to the channel directly below, or sign up at my Patreon at patreon.com/thecriminalhistorian. I'll see you next week, folks. Have yourself a wonderful evening.